Hi everyone, I wanted to do this video as a follow-up to the Anne Lovett case that I have covered, as I think it is important to explore the non-options women and young girls had before the 1990s and how they were treated by society as a whole, including their religious orders and the government. I want to warn you that this may be upsetting for some of you, and so would advise you not to watch this particular video. In the comments of the Anne Lovett case, I read all of them. Thank you so much for telling me your stories about yourselves, your mothers, aunts, cousins and sisters. The stories have been truly heartbreaking to read, except for a few, where things worked out and the girls got to keep their babies, and didn't end up in the laundries or had their babies taken from them. A disclaimer I wanted to put in also is that some of the information I will be including is from a documentary that was made by RTE, interviewing women who went through the ordeal of the laundries and the outcome and how it affected them for the rest of their lives. This is their stories and no one is to take that away from them. You can defend the churches until your heart's content, but remember these things were done to these women by the church and state, and this is their stories, not yours. I find these cases myself very upsetting and had all my emotions tested in doing this video, but I will try and keep my composure. I guess we will first look at the name Magdalene and what the church saw as appropriate by naming the institution, to add to the stigma placed on the girls and young women that ended up in the laundries. Mary Magdalene back then would have had a negative connotation in the church according to the churches. The portrayal of her as a prostitute began in 591, when Pope Gregory at his Easter sermon identified her as a repentant prostitute or promiscuous woman. Elaborate medieval legends from Western Europe then emerged, which told exaggerated tales of Mary Magdalene's wealth and beauty. The identification of Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and the unnamed sinful woman was still a major controversy in the years leading up to the Reformation, and some Protestant leaders rejected it. During the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church emphasised Mary Magdalene as a symbol of penance. In 1969, Pope Paul VI removed the identification of Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and the sinful woman from the general Roman calendar, but the view of her as a former prostitute has persisted in popular culture. So what I get from this, Mary Magdalene represented prostitution and penance of that time, which was brought forward onto the young women and girls who were seen as fallen women. On a side note, nowhere in the Bible does it state that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, but a woman that sinned. She was a woman that Jesus cast out 7 demons from, and who washed his feet, and of course was at the cross when he was crucified, and went to his tomb when he rose again. She was seen as the complete opposite to the Virgin Mary, and only became redeemed by confessing her sins and doing penance, according to the Catholic Church, and so society followed suit. In the late 18th century, the term fallen women primarily referred to sex workers, but by the end of the 19th century it was expanded to other types of women and girls, mainly those who found themselves pregnant outside of marriage. The Magdalene Laundries were filled with many different kinds, including those who were not prostitutes at all, but seduced women. Some of the fallen women had not willingly participated in sex. That is, they had been raped or molested. Some of the other girls and women were in the laundries because of circumstances. They were orphaned, abused, deserted by their families, or did not conform to social norms of the time. The history of Ireland in the 20th century contains a terrible story. That is, we managed to lock up 1% of our population within a whole network of institutions: psychiatric, mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries and industrial schools. Because of this, there's not a family in Ireland that has not been affected by this legacy. In Ireland, 10 Magdalene laundries were in operation from 1922 to 1996, but had been in existence since the 1700s. The first was set up on Lower Leeson Street in Dublin and run by the Church of Ireland, and accepted only Protestant women. But by the 19th century they were mainly run by Roman Catholic orders and quietly supported by the state. They were 4 in particular: the Religious Sisters, the Good Shepherd Sisters, the Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Refuge, and finally the Sisters of Mercy. Over 30,000 women worked and lived in these institutions, also known as asylums. Most of these women and girls were compelled to do so by the state, Catholic Church, or their families. Maureen Sullivan, now 72, entered the Magdalene Laundry, run by the Good Shepherd Sisters in New Ross, County Wexford. It was 1964 and she was just 12 years old. She had confided in her teacher that she was being physically and sexually abused by her stepfather, and within 24 hours Maureen was taken from her home and her beloved grandmother and sent to the Magdalene Laundries. She was told she would receive an education there, but immediately she was stripped of her meagre possessions and thrown into forced labour, washing clothes and scrubbing floors under inhumane and unrelenting conditions. Not allowed to speak, barely fed, and often going without water. You would get up in the morning and clean the corridors, and you'd wash the floors the first morning. The next morning you'd shine them, the next morning you'd wash them again, she said. Each morning after doing the floors, she'd go to Mass, back for breakfast, and then on to the laundries. Maureen was viciously beaten by the nuns for years. They also took away her name. It was changed to Frances. Over the following 4 years, Maureen was transferred to another laundry in Athy, County Kildare, and then to a home for the blind on Marion Road in Dublin. How a young girl so young was put in these institutions perplexed many who would interview her later, not least the interdepartmental committee set up in 2011 to investigate the laundries. They would ask, "How did you end up here?" And Maureen would tell them, "Because I was sexually abused by my stepfather." But the reason she was put in there was actually appalling. A nun that she and her friend had met in Carlow Town denied at a previous meeting that Maureen had ever been in New Ross Laundry. She insisted instead that Maureen had attended St. Aidan's School near the laundry. This second time the nun looked at Maureen and put her head down. She stared at her notes, moved them around under her fingertips, and then said, quote, "You must understand." She paused and shook her head. "You were an abused child." The nun continued, "They believed you could corrupt the innocence of the other children if you mixed with them." Maureen interjected after hearing these words, quote, "Sister, are you telling me they put me into the laundry and all of it because they thought I would tell the other children about what my stepfather done to me?" The nun continued, quote, "It was wrong, but yes, that's what they did." At New Ross there was no schooling, just the laundry every day from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m, with cleaning duties in the evening and at weekends. The women there were adults, many elderly. A regular visitor at the Magdalene Laundry was Mrs. Ryan, described as a cousin to J.F. Kennedy. She was a sort of celebrity in the community, more so since JFK died. There would be great ceremony when she came to the convent each time. She would leave a tin of sweets for the women, which rarely made it to them. A place called the Tunnel also existed. This is where, if any outsiders or inspectors were to visit, Maureen would be put in the tunnel, as she was young, malnourished and small for her age. One time, when she was 14, she was put in there and forgotten about and left there for hours. She became hysterical and it took her days to recover. One day Maureen went to the head nun complaining that her shoes were hurting her and that her mother said she should be earning a wage by now to buy shoes. The nun said yes, okay, and the following morning she was told to pack her stuff and was given £5 and was brought to Heuston Station. After Maureen left Dublin, she moved back to her hometown in Carlow, where she was not welcome, as she had told on her stepfather, and so off she went to live in England, with no form of education, no friends or support, and she had to take any meagre job in order to survive. She met her first husband here and had a little girl. They moved into a council flat and it was the first time she ever had anything of her own. It meant the world to her. The marriage didn't work out and so she was on her own, trying to hold down a job and raise her daughter. In time she remarried to a man from Westmeath and they had a son. In 1988 everything came to a head. her past, her lack of education, and the abuse she suffered. With this, Maureen tried to take her own life. She was now 37, and after surviving her suicide attempt, she decided she wanted to go home to Ireland. She sold her house and moved the family back there. But in doing so, all the bad memories came flooding back, and finally she went for counselling. At the same time, stories about what had happened to children in orphanages, industrial schools, and reformatories started to spill out into the media, and victims like Maureen began to tell their own stories to anyone who would listen. If you would like to read her book, I'll leave a link in the description box. Joan Burton ar Taoiseach between 2014 and 16. Taoiseach is a deputy prime minister in other parliamentary systems. She was born in 1949 and adopted via the Sisters of Mercy. Her mother had become pregnant outside of marriage, and so the parish priest at the time intervened. She knows that she was one of the lucky ones. She admits that if she had stayed, she would have been moved from orphanage to orphanage, and at the age of 14 or 15 could have been sent to a laundry. Joan expressed that she could not have survived them, that she would not have been strong enough. So you might ask, what contracts did the laundries have? The President of Ireland, the ministers, the Army, the Navy, the general hospitals, the hotels, the prisons, the mental hospitals and the meat factories all used the laundries. The girls were never paid a penny. They got their room and board, and that was it. The nuns claimed that they worked alongside them and did as much work as the women and girls. But you see, the difference was the nuns chose to be there. The others did not. They were prisoners. The nuns were running a business, and as one ex-nun said, because of this, they were less of a sister of mercy. Gabrielle O'Gorman was born in the mother and baby home in 1945 at the Good Shepherd Convent in Limerick. She remained institutionalised for 19 and a half years. They told her to wear the uniform, change her name, do what she was told, or she would never get out. She was given the name Stella and she refused it. The nun got her by the hair, pushed her down on her knees and told her, "You are here because nobody wants you." Gabrielle would say those words always stuck with her. She was also punished for her beauty. The nuns would tell her as she got older that she, quote, would corrupt an army of soldiers, that she was a temptation to men. Gabrielle would say that she thought the nuns wanted to clip her wings and stop her from being who she was. Gabrielle has memories of all the women and girls working these big machines, the rollers where they'd put the sheets in, singing hymns, and all you could smell was carbolic soap and steam. And those women and girls worked all day. Those that didn't work fast enough or good enough got a dig of the cross that the nuns wore around their waist, attached to rosary beads, which, by the way, rosary beads are not biblical. The nuns would wrap their fingers around the cross with a good hold of it and shove it into the sides of the women and girls. The bruises would last for weeks as a reminder. They were constantly told that no one loved them, that their mothers abandoned them. Nobody wrote to them. But you see, the letters were kept from the women and girls by the nuns, and the letters the women and girls wrote to their families were never posted. Gabrielle was told by her mother that she never once received a letter from her. Gabrielle remembers when John F. Kennedy came to Ireland in June 1963. The film crew and JFK came to visit the Good Shepherd Convent in Limerick, as he wanted to see where the lace that had been made as a gift and given to the President for his wife Jackie by the government upon his arrival. Gabrielle was told she would dress as a bride and wear the veil. But what was a poignant moment for John F. Kennedy to meet the women that produced the lace, it was a different memory for Gabrielle, as at that stage she was already trapped in this institution 18 years with no way out. JFK vowed to return to Ireland, but he would be assassinated a few months later, on the 22nd of November of that same year. Gabrielle met a girl who was in the same institution as her, and they had remembered each other from childhood. So they arranged for them both to run away together. They noticed the vans coming in at 2 p.m. every day to collect the laundry, and so Gabrielle told her friend to be ready. A lot of the women were trying to stop them from leaving, but they got out. But their freedom did not last long. As they ran and ran along the cobblestones, the Gardaí caught up with them and brought them back. A lot of the women that did escape made a beeline for England. It was the closest place they could run to and be out of Ireland. Gabrielle, at 19 years of age, was woken up one morning and told to pack her stuff. You are leaving today. Like others before her, she went to England, and here she met a man that would physically abuse her. She didn't know any different, as this was what she had grown up with. Being slapped and walloped by the nuns was second nature to her, and so she stayed within this abusive marriage. Eventually, though, she broke away from this relationship. Gabrielle would meet a man, Frank, through the internet. They had met and dated 47 years earlier when they were young, and he was a brother to her friend at the time. When Gabrielle had found him on Facebook, they met, and Gabrielle said to him, "I thought you would have come and rescued me." His reply was, "I would have, but I didn't know where you were." They are still together to this day. In Galway city, there was a family that lived on a corporation estate called Merview in the city. They were parents Hugh and Ina McEntee and their 3 sons Declan, Hugo and Andy. The boys growing up knew of the Magdalene Laundry, and they said the general consensus around the city at that time was the laundry was full of women and young girls that had babies outside wedlock, and they were tarnished as scarlet women and known as the Maggies. To boost the finances of the household, Ina, the mother, went to work at the Magdalene Laundry as a lay worker. Ina got close to the girls that were institutionalised there, and in turn they opened up to Ina with their tales of woe. Ina would bring these tales home to her dinner table in the evening, and 2 of Ina's sons began talking on their own, knowing that they had to do something for these girls. They eventually went to their parents asking them to help. Once the parents agreed, weeks of planning began, trying to decide what was the best way to get the girls out. Eventually, they came up with a plan. The Magdalene Laundry was on Foster Street, and there was a walkway up by the side of the church which led to Prospect Hill. It was arranged that the dad, Hugh, would have his van waiting there, and Declan, one of the sons, stood at the side of the van, waiting to open the door once the girls appeared. The other son, Hugo, stood at the gate to the laundry to open it. The mother, Ina, would be inside the laundry to open the inner door. Andy was on the other side of the door to lead the girls up to the gate. The first night 4 girls escaped, and the boys recalled that they never met girls so scared. The boys were scared, but there was no comparison to what they saw in the girls. When they got the girls in the van, they all lay on the floor with one of the boys as lookout to see if anyone was following them. They drove straight down Prospect Hill, down by the side of Eyre Square and past the gates of the Magdalene Laundry on Foster Street and out to their home on Merview Estate. The whole journey took around 15 minutes. As soon as the family arrived at their home, one of the boys flew out of the back of the van, ran to the front door to open it, and once open, everyone piled into the house and closed the door with a sigh of relief from all parties involved. The girls had no idea where they were, and they didn't care. All they knew was they were safe. The family thought they were breaking the law, that they had stolen these girls, but in fact they weren't. It was the laundry that were breaking the law. The boys, now men, called what they did the Great Escape. Some of the neighbours of the McEntees were let in on what the family had done. They were respected for what they had done, and no one said a word. The girls never went outside. They were happy to stay in the house. They could make tea, listen to the radio, read books and newspapers. It was like a holiday to them. In the meantime, Hugh and Ina contacted the girls' families or friends they had in England in order to get them permanent freedom. Once the details were finalised, Mr. McEntee would bring the girls to the train station, fund the price of their tickets and make sure they were safely on their way to their respective destinations. In all, the McEntee family rescued 15 girls. The nuns finally copped on that it had to be an inside job. The only insider that was an actual outsider was Ina McEntee. The nuns wrote to Ina, and in the envelope was a letter with some money. The letter stated that she was no longer required. The letter was read out to the whole family, and they all fell around laughing, and a celebration ensued for what they had succeeded in doing, to give those 15 girls their freedom. Margaret Bullen was Magdalene number 322. Margaret was committed to an industrial school in 1954 at the age of 2. She left the Magdalene Laundry 49 years later in a coffin. For women like Margaret, there was no way out and nowhere to go. She would go on to have twin girls at the age of 19 in St. Patrick's Mother and Baby Home on the Navan Road, where she had been transferred from the Sean McDermott Street Laundry in Dublin city centre. These little girls would be put up for adoption when they were 9 months old. Many years later, when the girls were young adults, they tracked down Margaret. They arranged to meet her in the Gresham Hotel in Dublin. When they walked in, they found Margaret standing in her best Sunday dress, made of polyester, and holding a handbag like the Queen held it. She dropped this bag, and out of politeness one of the girls helped to pick it up. As she did so, it opened and there was nothing inside of it. Margaret had nothing. The girls were polite, friendly and open, and so Margaret would tell them a bit about her life. She was very proud that she did the readings at Mass. Margaret had never been in a place like the Gresham Hotel, and she was in awe. She had never tasted coffee. The girls would ask her, "Do you take milk?" and Margaret would reply, "Do you take milk?" And if they did, she did. And it was the same when it came to sugar. They'd ask Margaret, "Do you take sugar?" and she would reply, "Do you take sugar?" And if they did, she would also. There was too much of a gap, and the girls' lifestyle was so different to Margaret's that they could not bond with each other. Margaret was provided with a roof over her head, she was fed, and other than that she had no life outside the walls of the laundry. The girl's adoptive father would sometimes go down to the laundry over the years and bring Margaret a €50 voucher for Dunnes Stores, so she could buy some clothes for herself. One of the helpers would bring her out to buy things, but Margaret would mostly spend the money on cigarettes. In October 2003, the national radio station had a programme called Liveline. A caller phoned in to tell a story about Margaret and announced that she had passed away the previous August. She stated she was the youngest person that had entered the laundries and the longest member. She was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in a plot where all the other women that had been institutionalised in the Magdalene Laundries were buried. Margaret's girls were not notified of her death and therefore did not attend the funeral. They had to find out on live radio that their mother had died. The girls phoned the institution to say they were absolutely distraught to find out that she had died and hadn't been told, and as her children they had a right to mourn her as other families. They told them that they wanted an explanation as to why they were not told about Margaret's death and wanted any of her personal effects returned to them. The girls received a return call from a PR company telling them there was nothing available. Women that knew Margaret told stories of her to this same radio station. They said she was hungry from 5 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock in the evening when she finished working in the laundry after having 2 babies. They said Margaret was a lovely girl, kind, gentle, and had a horrible life. A horrible, horrible life. People also asked would the family not have Margaret put in her own grave by herself with her own headstone. The family thought on this but decided to leave her where she was. She was buried with her friends, the people she grew up with and knew her best. They feel that she is in the right place. In 1993, unmarked graves of 155 women were uncovered in the convent grounds of one of the laundries. This led to media revelations about the operations of the secretive institutions. A formal state apology was issued in 2013, and a compensation scheme for survivors was set up by the Irish government, which by 2022 had paid out €32.8 million to 814 women. An investigation began, and in turn women, for the first time, started to speak about their experiences in the Magdalene Laundries. Finally, a report was released called the McAleese Report, which stated that they did not make any findings on physical abuse in the laundries. Some people's evidence was being weighted more heavily than others. The report very much enjoyed anybody that was presenting documentary evidence, and who better to provide this type of evidence than the state and the Catholic Church. The people were getting the official history rather than the actual history. In 2013, the then Taoiseach apologised and made promises he did not keep. The opportunity was there for the state to build on that apology by properly compensating the women of the laundries. The government specifically called the scheme that was set up to compensate these women ex gratia, which is a Latin term for something that is given as a gift and not a recognition of wrongdoing. Depending on how long you had spent in a Magdalene laundry, this was anything up to €100,000. When it came to documentary evidence, this is where the victims fell short. They had little or no evidence of their time spent in these laundries. Many couldn't read or write as they got no education. Their names were changed when they entered, so the nuns could say Billy was Jack and Mary was Bridget, and it wouldn't be proved otherwise. All the victims had were memories. The burden of proof should not have fallen so heavily on these women. Their stories should have been enough. For 13 months in the institution, one woman was awarded €21,500. €16,500 she got in 2014, and the other €5,000 was given in 2018, after fighting tooth and nail to get it. Another woman applied for compensation. When she sent in the evidence she could muster together, she was sent back a letter stating that her records of events did not conform with their records. They suggested she accept the minimum offered to her or fight for more in court. This woman did not have the time or resources to fight this decision, and so accepted what was offered to her. The state will live forever. The victims of the Magdalene Laundries will not. The government initially made a lump sum payment of over €29 million to 734 women, plus a top-up payment for some, which brought their weekly income to the equivalent of the Irish contributory state pension. However, after significant numbers of claims were refused or modified, the Ombudsman determined in 2017 that the redress scheme was built on a flawed administrative process and maladministration. Following the Ombudsman's report, the government commissioned 2 reviews of the restorative justice system. As a result, 81 further women received redress. 130 had their awards increased. To date, a total of €32.8 million has been paid out to 814 women, with 6 cases still in progress. They also eventually received special access to healthcare that a medical card did not provide. Many had ailments due to working in the laundries, such as asthma, back pain and cancer. The survivors, however, insisted that the access to healthcare falls short. Over 90% of the women who were enslaved in Magdalene Laundries died before receiving any acknowledgement or compensation. In 2018, another woman, Elizabeth Coppin, brought her case to the United Nations Committee Against Torture. The Irish state denies any liability for the alleged mistreatment of Elizabeth in the Magdalene Laundries. The state claimed that these institutions were private and had nothing to do with the state. Elizabeth was not confined in any legal sense. Essentially, there's nothing to see here. The state claimed that they had no role to play in her care, in her abuse or anything she endured. They are basically trying to pass the buck on the church and the nuns. Elizabeth says yes, they did play a part in it, but the state were the ones responsible for her at that time. In February 2023, the UN found favour of Ireland. The majority decision was made under Articles 12, 13, 14 and 16 of the Convention Against Torture. The UN stated that the matters raised were historical and that Elizabeth had waived her rights in exchange for ex gratia payments. Elizabeth had been born in a county home to a teenage single mother. Aged 2, she was taken from her mother and a judge committed her to an industrial school. As a teenager between 1964 and 1968, she was held in 3 different Magdalene Laundries. A child separated from family, she was entirely dependent on those in charge of the institutions. Religious women of high social standing, who regularly reminded her that she was considered an unwanted product of her mother's sin. They subjected her to arbitrary detention, exhausting forced labour, neglect, unsanitary living conditions, denial of identity, denial of privacy, and ritual humiliation. She has lived with the mental health consequences ever since, as do the other women. The young children were mixed in with the women that had been in there for years. These women were traumatised from their babies being taken from them, and they would walk the halls and dormitories at night looking for their babies, crying out in anguish. This in turn frightened the children that had to share this space with these women. There was also a story of a woman who gave birth to her daughter in one part of the convent. This baby was taken away from her. 16 years later, she would meet her daughter, who had been raised in another part of the same convent. They didn't even know they were in the same room at times, let alone the same building. I guess this sums it up. Thank you for watching if you got this far. I really appreciate it.